In line with the episode's theme, this week's National Park Service destination is a shipwreck. And as the cooler and even downright cold weather of fall and winter are on their way, close your eyes for a second as we travel to Biscayne National Park in South Florida. Just south of Miami and at the northeast end of the long strand of islands known collectively as the Florida Keys. Specifically, this is a look at the wreck of one of the 5 shipwrecks within the Biscayne National Park borders. This time, the British steamer Lugano, which was headed for the port of Havana, Cuba, out of Liverpool. The wreck happened in March 1913 and contained a cargo of luxuries from London and over 100 Spanish citizens planning on immigrating to Cuba. Because at this point, Cuba had recently become an independent nation from Spain and would enter into this weird period of kind of being an American colony, but not really, but sort of. It's complicated. The shipwreck site is of interest for more than some warm water fun. All the passengers were rescued, so there's nothing creepy or gory about it, but the cargo of the ship, valued at $1,019,13, that's really of interest. It was European luxuries, silks, wines, rice, and other fancy foods, so the luxury stuff of the Atlantic world was still often coming from Europe, not America at all. And that's really on theme here. Almost 90% of the cargo was lost, not destroyed so much, but rather salvaged by a large number of outfits, legal and otherwise. And the less legal ones tended to stash the goods in the reefs and little islands dotting the area for later pickup. Of note, this wreck happened during Prohibition in America, when all alcohol-containing beverages over 3.2% ethanol were illegal, except for a wide variety of loopholes. But anyway, the wine and liquor aboard that boat, it was made particularly valuable for that reason. Sitting under just about 25 feet of water. This is a fairly accessible wreck and typical of the thousands of boat wrecks in this area. The water is shallow and the rocks and the coral will get you. In fact, they're still getting people to this day, even with all the electronic navigation gadgetry we have. The ship's manifest tells us much of what rich people stuff, what was worth shipping that far, and the ship's hybrid construction that was somewhere between the all-wooden sailing ships that moved cargo around for much of the 19th century and the all-steel, fossil fuel-powered commercial shippers that moved cargo in the post-World War II world. Sure, this particular boat had an engine, but the living navigation and communication conditions were much closer to those for wooden boat sailors than to those found in the modern Navy or on modern cargo shippers. This wreck from just over 100 years ago still gives visitors a glimpse into the further away past. Just for your information, the 4 other wrecks in this area cover a span of time from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th. Possibly the most interesting thing is seeing the trend of engine-powered cargo ships with sails for taking advantage of favorable wind. It's being revived now. Sure, the sails people are looking at putting on modern cargo ships look very different, but the thinking is the same. Energy has once again become valuable enough that wind power matters. So, as long as it's not hurricane season, head out to Biscayne National Park and check out some sunken boats. Episode 103, Pirates, Privateers, Smugglers, and Slavers. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at how America's taste for luxury drove gray and black market actions on the high seas, despite our myth-making around the tried and true blue Yankee. This country has always had a taste for things that fell off a truck or could be got by my cousin who, can give it to you at the family price. And this period of war for America was particularly fruitful for both sellers and the buyers. To see how America's taste for the finer things, literally the luxury foods of the day, tied into the actions of the ladies and gentlemen of an official avoiding bent. Pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in the late 18th century, you used to be able to buy half a lime on the early American waterfront. They were that rare and intriguing. It's interesting enough that people would advertise half a lime, but the fact that people apparently would show up and want to buy that's something else entirely. The literature doesn't exactly say who was selling the limes, but this fact alone says a lot about the smallness and the bigness of the lots people purchased their food in, and that they could be both weirdly tiny and strangely huge by our standards. Can you imagine purchasing your wine or beer by the 50 or 120-gallon barrel full? How about several of them at the same time? And today, while a 10-pound sack of sugar is where most people top out, what about 2 25-pound cones of sugar that you have to hit and hack at each time you want to use it? And then there are those multi-quart or multi-liter fancy ceramic jars of ginger. Dried, by the way, not the fresh stuff we get. Or nutmegs, but just one nut at a time. Or say less than a jar full of cloves. And yes, that half a lime. Now, before you get too weirded out by that half a lime, it just meant that somebody with a few limes found that they could sell them half a lime at a time. It's not some guy who had like half a lime in his pocket. That'd be weird. But it is these stable luxury items, or at least semi-stable, that could survive at least months at sea, and for some items like dried spices and fortified wine and distilled liquors, maybe years in transport from producer to consumer. And the more shelf-stable, or in these times, more barrel-stable these items were, the more likely they were to be items that could be smuggled, or otherwise brought to market by means that didn't exactly submit to the customs and tax inspections. But stuff wasn't the only thing that was smuggled. So were people. In the early years of America, immigration was a funny thing. One could get a passport or a visa, but they weren't exactly required. You could kind of just show up. And people did. When they were coming to America to run away from their own wars or troubles and do the starting over thing, having an official identity wasn't that important. In fact, sometimes it might actually be a problem. Same as when one was traveling to rejoin family. Everyone who mattered knew everyone, so it was fine. Passports and visas mattered more when there was business to be done, money to be exchanged, or government policy to be carried out. It was good to know you were actually dealing with the right person when you were in the process of, say, selling Louisiana, after all. So there were free immigrants who had no papers, but then there were the enslaved. They had no papers either. I mean, they were cargo. And up through 1808, they were legal cargo. And they were also the first significant energy shipping industry. Earlier, I had grabbed onto their value as labor. But in our mechanical technological age, one can also see how they were packaged energy to be applied. This idea hit me in the face while catching up on my reading. Amitav Ghosh, who wrote about the Indian end of the British-Chinese opium wars that we're sneaking up on, has a new book out called The Nutmeg's Curse. He started writing the book about the time I was starting this podcast. He talks about how much of the world shipping is taken up with transporting energy, gas, coal, oil, that sort of thing. But that's when it hit me. The transatlantic slave trade was really early energy shipping. And then as the laws changed and changed again, the slavers were smuggling energy, just the way oil smuggling goes on now as different embargoes and such are issued. Valuable then and valuable now. See, as part of the early political deal-making and horse trading at the establishment of America, it was decided that chattel slavery wouldn't be ended, but the importation of enslaved people from outside the borders of America would become illegal. So slavers went from being legitimate businessmen to smugglers and pirates from one day to the next, which made the Caribbean an interesting place for several decades. Haiti went completely out of the slave trade due to the Haitian Revolution in 1790 and the messy decades that followed. Britain outlawed the importation of slaves the year before us in 1807, so no more trading with, say, Barbados or Jamaica. The French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonies would continue to provide and receive slaves legally as other partners in the smuggling game, as would Spain for most of this time. And Cuba kept on importing slaves for almost the longest. So there was about to be a couple of decades of weird cat and mouse, and gosh, I didn't realize I couldn't import slaves to this port type activities in the Caribbean. After everyone more or less stops allowing the importation of enslaved people, the game will change once again. But in America, for quite a while, slavers worked in the world of smugglers until the American Navy and Coast Guard were built up as part of the new Monroe Doctrine shape of the world. Then smuggling people simply became more risk than reward, and the growing mechanization of farm labor was seriously changing things as well. To peek in on some of the troubles facing this used to be a merchant and now suddenly a smuggler class of sailor, the book The Black Joke by A.E. Rooks is a great read, because slaver ships were built for speed and of very specific shapes. Most slavers didn't really get into other sorts of smuggling. And then there was the fact that the smugglers of, say, distilled liquors, molasses, and dry luxuries like spices, silks, silver, and sugar, they had cargo they could stash, and they wanted nothing to do with the difficult, perishable, noisy people. While slavers are easier to separate out and define, and the fact that they were providing energy for the cash cropping of sugar, and so also molasses and rum, as well as coffee and the growing Caribbean spice and citrus trade, they made these luxuries something possible for America. But to actually get the lemons and the allspice and the coffee and the sugar and such to American shores, you still needed merchants and smugglers and pirates and privateers. Before we get any further, I think it's worth spending a little time figuring out what's the difference between all those guys. Well, merchants are easy. Those are the ones with licenses and storefronts. They pay duties and can tell everyone what they do for a living. And because they're legal entities working within the legal structures of the day, all the registered merchants were men. At the other end are the pirates. Now, these people, mostly men, but by no means all, again, lawless folk, they have no safe state, no place where they can rest, protected by any law. Sure, there are pirate bases and places where navies don't bother to go, but pirates live and work and trade officially outside the law. Of course, many a port city, New York, Newport, New Orleans, Charleston, Baltimore, and so on, all had their pirate sightings and pirate bars and pirate stories. After all, Robert Louis Stevenson, when he wrote Treasure Island, which is, sure, full of fanciful things, he did base the idea and the legend of Long John Silver on scraps and stories that had some elements that were real. That and the current fascination with the TV show Our Flag Means Death, these pirates existed and crossed paths with the legal world, but they were always having to grease the wheels with large bribes. Their existence required graft and bribery. So big risk and occasional big reward, but terrible job security. And if you're caught by someone who you couldn't bribe or maybe couldn't bribe anymore, the death that awaited was rather horrid. It usually involved some combination of flogging, hanging, or possibly being tied to a post below the tide line and drowning in a particularly slow and grisly manner. Privateers and smugglers live in between the two extremes of legal merchant and pirate. A privateer was someone who was allowed to do piratey type things, but under the legal cover of something called a letter of marque, which basically said, sure, be a pirate, but only for our side and only at times of war. This, of course, got complicated fast. Sometimes these piratey types were pirates already, but got letters from a government giving them legal cover. Sometimes the wars that were underway were secretly and not openly declared. Wait, a secret war, you say? Well, okay, remember the moving around of the Louisiana Territory involved a secret treaty. So yeah, there were sometimes kind of secret wars as well. But even twistier than that was where a pirate or a privateer might get letters of marque from both or multiple sides in a conflict, or might have forged or fake ones. And then communication being what it was in those days, a privateer might continue doing piratey things long after the end of a conflict. That war was over in February and we're friends now? How was I to know? Question mark, shrug, etc., etc. All in all, the privateer thing was always a bad idea and never really got the government who authorized it anything but bad feelings and embarrassing questions. Though, sure, there were a few privateers who only worked for one side and, more importantly, had the right friends in the right places so they could possibly come home at the end. So sure, privateering had better, possibly long-term prospects than pirating, but because in the end, most of them couldn't completely stop doing piratey things, they also usually came to bad ends. So if you were really going to get into trading outside or maybe not quite inside the law, but wanted a quiet old age, smuggling was really where it was at. In fact, quite a few merchants and their employees and shipmasters who mostly followed the law would also engage in a bit of smuggling. And the biggest distinction between pirating and or privateering versus smuggling is the taking aspect. In its most straightforward aspect, smuggling is still just business. There's the buying and selling of items. It's just that, say, customs, duties, or taxes are not paid. Or it's the continuation of a trade that's been outlawed. Either way, suppliers and consumers are exchanging funds for goods. It's just the government or a regulating entity that's cut out. Pirating, on the other hand, requires taking, straight up stealing of an item for no or at times vastly reduced pay. A pirate may actually sell at the other end on an open market and pay taxes or duties to gain legitimacy. But the taking of goods is the important part of the pirate act. And because many people object to being stolen from or being personally stolen themselves, violence is often involved. That's not to say pirates and privateers didn't also engage in smuggling, because heck yeah, they totally did. But there were quite a few smugglers who managed to do what they did without spilling over into piracy. Being a quiet, occasional smuggler under the cover of mostly doing regular business, that was the most common form, and also the way most smugglers went on to live a long life. Okay, with those distinctions and definitions out of the way, what does all of this have to do with American food during these years of war and adventure? Are we going to talk about what slavers, smugglers, pirates, and privateers ate? Or is there something else here? I'm happy to report it's mostly about something else. To keep things straight, all of these people in ships ate more or less what all the other sailors and even soldiers and adventurers ate. After all, there was a pretty short list of travel food, on foot or on boats. So, salt meat stew, salt fish, hominy and grits, ship's biscuit, bits of dried fruit, bad beer, watered rum, that is, grog, and occasional glimmers of dried fruit or jam. It was all the same all the way around, whether you were working within or outside the law. No, the big difference really was what the actions of all of these people working at the margins of or way outside the law did to American ideas about who could have luxury stuff. So at this point in time, Europe was hierarchical in ways that are hard for most of us to imagine today. See, based on who you were, say, are you a woman, or who your parents were, do you know both of them, and what was your father's name, or where you were born, or the color of your skin, all of these things could legally exclude you from being able to go places, or have certain jobs, or even wear certain clothes. Sumptuary laws, that is, laws that could result in your imprisonment or fines, were laws that determined whether a person could wear things like silk or furs or even certain colors, and would sometimes prescribe things like sleeve styles or the shape of your shoes. And sumptuary laws could also apply to what foods someone was allowed to buy or be seen consuming. So in places, people, by law, based on their birth, were barred from entering parts of towns or portions of churches and using modes of travel. As a result, because it was such a bother to break these laws, large classes of people would start to sort of automatically disqualify themselves from owning certain things or living certain places or having certain jobs or things like that. I mean, depending on where you were and who you were, things like reading was getting above oneself. Wanting to taste things like, say, taste chocolate or cinnamon or strawberries were foolish dreams likely to cause one to come to a bad end. Desiring a non-scratchy shirt or shift was for finer people than me. Sort of this myth of a society where people knew their place developed, and it's based on these strictures and self-policing. Of course, the fact that smugglers and pirates and such have always existed proves that the populace willing to accept such restrictions has always been a myth. America, while billing itself as more or less a classless society, totally had layers of society. No, there was no legal nobility, but social mobility was pretty limited outside of times of war, and out on the fringes where people who could get stuff done typically got the job. But a big difference was that everybody felt like they were entitled to and able to wear what they wanted, eat what they desired, and stand where they felt like. Freedom of assembly and all that. Sure, in places with slave codes, there absolutely were restrictions about where non-free persons could go, and places would do things like make laws about no drinking on Sunday and stuff. But they were written to apply to all, even if they weren't exactly enforced that way. So in general, compared to Europe, restrictions were smaller, more relaxed, and more routinely ignored and skirted. And so it was more likely that just about everyone would think of themselves as a person who could potentially drink hot chocolate or sip Madeira wine or consume half a lime. Well, there was rich people food for sure, yes, like rice. It was only for rich people because they had the cash and the kitchen staff. There weren't really any rules saying you couldn't get it if you too got the cash. And so instead of just catering rice or beef or nice flour to those who should be eating it, there were plenty of early Americans thinking, hey, why not work on selling the nice stuff to everyone who wants it? How about finding ways to make more beef or butter or candied orange peel so I can sell it to more people? England was working very hard on ramping up the industrial production of food at this age and would get out ahead of America in manufactured food at the start. But while much of the British manufacture was focused on the food of the worker, after all, the best people got their food from their estates in the country and from overseas merchant houses, the Americans, they started in early on the idea of providing a taste of the fancy for everyone. Which once again gets us back to our pirates and smugglers and such. For as long as there has been in America, and actually slightly before that, we have been addicted to the, quote, things that have fallen off the back of a truck, unquote. Well, that particular phraseology was popularized in American gangster movies and referred to truck cargoes that were, say, different than what appeared on a manifest. So some of the items were being sold without tax or import duties. Colonists had been doing some version of that ever since British customs inspectors set up in the Caribbean. Even before they started setting up shop on the continent, enslaved people were being smuggled in with no duties paid. Sugar, molasses, and rum were being smuggled out. The amount of silver pilfered from Spanish treasure ships both by pirates and the Spanish themselves, is uncountable. There are scholarly estimates using mining records on how much rock was moved at places like the Potosi mine, how many donkey loads went down the side of mountains, and how many ships sailed, that lead people to guesstimate that up to half the silver mined for the Spanish ended up smuggled somehow off the royal rolls. In fact, if you look at how there was a coinage shortage in early America, but a strange concentration of silversmiths in the mid-Atlantic states, where plenty of pirates were known to land and have things like favorite taverns and get all chummy with certain local officials, this also raises questions about the discrepancy between official and unofficial silver. And then there's the China trade picking up, with American sailors who are starting to mix it up with the British over tea, porcelain, and silk. And these people are all getting tangled up in the opium trade, which didn't directly affect America this early on, but the smuggling of tea will pick up quickly, as will the distribution of improperly labeled and adulterated tea. But the real lasting effect on American food that these unsettled years of 1776 to 1815 will have, this time of widespread war and adventure, will be giving far more people a taste for the elements of luxury. Back in Europe, until well into the age of Napoleon, there was a clear aristocratic officer class, and no cruddy common soldier might climb into those ranks. There was no way, or almost no way, he could afford to. Being an officer cost a lot, with horses and uniforms and mess fees and dress balls you had to go to. It cost a lot to be an officer. Oh, yeah, and you had to buy your way in. Good news is you could sell it on your way out. But Americans, with their limited populations, were more likely to pick up any old talented guy and elevate his status. They'd let him eat at the officer's table or in a company boardroom. There just simply weren't enough people to start keeping most of them out of the higher ranks of society if they could capably fill a hole. So while Americans might eschew the finer points of, say, caring about the pairing of what sauce with what game bird, or what appropriate dinner conversation was, or that there should even be dinner conversation, Americans were more likely to believe that they should have access to whatever dainty they desired, or at least when they could afford it. More or less. Nothing was out of reach just based on one's status. In other words, why not me? And the smuggler and pirate culture that had been there from the start fed that belief, and so thrived because the smugglers and pirates fed and grew that same market. So here we are in the 21st century, where every new food luxury, from fancy pink Himalayan sea salt to truffle-filled burgers, is shown to everyone as a food they should want. Because why not? Next week, speaking of why not, America has always had a taste for birds, chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese, but not really rabbits. Sure, people ate rabbit in early America, but it was never thought of as an American food. So next week, we'll look into this whole bird versus rabbit question. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Well, in just about 1 week from now, Saturday, November 4th, you can catch me and a whole gaggle of history podcasters at the Intelligent Speech online conference. You can get your tickets now at intelligentspeechonline.com, and you can use my discount code, which is FOOD. You can see me live, see other history podcasters live, get a taste of what my other podcast is like, because my co-host Jamie and I will be talking with other historians on a panel about contingencies for women. Show up and you can even ask questions. Again, my discount code is FOOD. You can also catch my unscripted self as I do a deep dive into the 19th century with my co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud, which really comes across as a lot of crime. Lots and lots of crime. We're using the HBO show Warrior as our anchor right now, but there are plenty of detours into other 19th century associated films. You'll learn all sorts of new things. I mean, we always are. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. You can also find me on Threads and Insta as THOA Food, but sadly, I'm all X'd out. All this information is available in the show description.
My name's Sebastian Major, and I am the host of the Our Fake History podcast.
I'm Rebecca Larson with the Tudors Dynasty podcast.
This is Greta Harden.
My name is Benjamin Jacobs.
I'm Anton.
And I'm Rick.
I'm David Montgomery.
I'm Bree.
My name is Roberto Toro.
I'm Jamie.
And I'm Rob. We will be speaking at Intelligent Speech.
I am looking forward to speaking at Intelligent Speech 2023.
I will be speaking at Intelligent Speech Online this year.
Mark your calendars for this November 4th. Intelligent Speech, the online conference for history fans by history podcasters.
It's a 3-ring circus of fascinating content with around 24 hours of live presentations.
This year is all about contingencies.
Times when history meets the unexpected.
The topic of my keynote address is no contingencies.
The Tudors and their contingency plans.
So go to intelligentspeechonline.com to get your tickets.
We'll see everybody on November 4th.